Thank you to all the teachers who have taught us throughout our years at SMSH.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Moira, Mrs. S, Mrs. Sullivan, Mrs. Pierre, Mrs. Diamond, Miss Sullivan, Miss Sacco,
Mrs. Wojcik, Mrs. McKenna,
Miss Smith,
Mrs. Montesano,
Mrs. Clausius,
Mrs. Burns, Mrs. Petterson, Mr. Brunel,
Mrs. Antea,
Mrs. Sirac,
Mrs. Sweet,
Miss Hanson,
Mrs. D'Angelo,
Mrs. McNamara,
Mr. Stolberg, Mrs. Gartman, Mrs. Ahern, Mrs. Warden, Mrs. Totten, Mrs. O'Neill, Mrs. McGill, Mrs. Ryan, Mrs. Susan, Mrs. LeCompte,
Mrs. Murphy, Mrs. O'Hare, Mrs. Howard, Mrs. Houston,
Mrs. Peixoto,
Father Dave.
Mrs. Moira helps us do work and she explains it and she helps us. She helps us with our letters. She helps with our numbers. She gives us a super bee every day. Mrs. Sullivan has us do calendars to learn the days and months of the year. She helps us when we're stuck on a paper. She is nice and caring. She's a very nice teacher to all the kids in the class, and she makes learning really fun because she does different things in a lot of different ways. And I like Mrs. Piet because she helps us all the time. Mrs. Diamond is helpful. She helps us when we're hurt. She's pretty. She's very nice and she loves teaching us.
Mrs. Sullivan really helps a lot with us with doing math and all that stuff. She's a really good teacher and all. It's great being in her class.
When I need help, she comes and gives me hints and usually she makes me always smile.
Mrs. Wojcik has really fun projects like the one we're doing right now, which is a project about animals and their habitats. And Mrs. Wojcik helps me by asking me questions and breaking the questions down for me so I can get the answer by doing that.
Mrs. McKenna is really awesome. She makes math really fun and easy to learn.
Miss Smith makes learning fun by being fun in every way.
Mrs. Montesano makes learning very fun by playing games with us. She's very nice and I really like her when she teaches us all the different subjects we have to learn in school.
Mrs. Clausius. She helps us a lot in class. She encourages us a lot with different types of games like the basketball game for math and all types of review, Mendel for science, and she puts up a lot of posters to help us in math.
Mrs. Burns is a great teacher because it's not just her talking to us, she has us interact throughout the lesson, which makes it easier to learn.
For example, she lets us make edible cells, which makes learning fun!
Mrs. Petterson!
She's such a great teacher and she always has new ways to teach us.
And she's always really helpful when we need extra help on all of our work.
Mr. Brunel is a great teacher who not only makes things fun with holidays such as Pi Day and Christmas where we do fun things, but he makes sure we understand it to the point we need to succeed.
Thank you, Mrs. Synthia, for helping me to be the student I am today.
She's always coming up with new and fun ways to teach us.
She taught us some songs. Want to hear them?
Such as new vocab words, new vocab words, grammar lessons, grammar lessons. Thank you for all your help, Mrs. Sirac.
We have 2 words for her. Wicked awesome. She helps us learn the scream.
You turn learning into
A class of fun activities.
Mrs. D'Angelo helps us a lot when our password doesn't go, so she helps us a lot and she helps us get onto the website, and when we can't log off, she helps us log off.
Mrs. McNamara is a great teacher who's not only fun but helps us get a better understanding of the concept of Spanish.
She's preparing us for high school Spanish but making it super fun at the same time.
I think music is really fun because he makes learning the recorder a fun activity to do, and I love playing it for my family when they come over.
Mrs. Scottman's fantastic. Mrs. Todd is nice. Mrs. Ahern.
Helpful.
Mrs. Warden, fashionable. Mrs. O'Neill is funny.
Mrs. McGill is energetic.
Mrs. Ryan is helpful. You taught us wonderful stuff. Thank you, Mrs. Murphy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Susan and Mrs. Klump here, super nice and super fun, and whenever I get a boo-boo, you make me go woohoo!
Mrs. O'Hare is always so cheerful. Every time I walk by with our folder, she always has a smile and says hi.
Mrs. Houston handles all the grandparent events. She does so much for our school.
Thank you. Mrs. Howard. She's the best secretary ever.
Yeah, and she was also the best babysitter ever, even though I don't really remember. And you're really nice and you help out with stuff.
Mrs. Peixoto.
Thank you for being the leader of our school.
And you're always coming up with creative ways to make our school more enjoyable.
Father Dave is the best shepherd our flock could have.
We enjoy helping him during class.
He is a fantastic choir director.
Thank you, Father Dave.